Have you ever noticed that you are living, but not truly inside your own life? Each day passes with a familiar schedule, familiar roles, and choices that seem right. Yet somewhere deep inside, there is a quiet emptiness you cannot quite name. It is not exactly suffering, nor is it unhappiness. It is simply a sense of being out of sync, as if you are living someone else's life, not yet your own. Carl Jung referred to this state as a separation from the self, where a person identifies with expectations, masks, and social roles, and forgets the deepest voice within. The paradox is this: you can be very successful, highly recognized, and still feel empty because the I, being nourished, is not the self, but only an adaptive version built to survive. And Jung believed that life truly begins at the moment a person dares to turn inward and face themselves, including their vulnerability, contradictions, and desires that were once buried, not to become more perfect, but to become more real. In this video, I will walk with you through 9 layers of inner experience. 9 important markers that show how you may be gradually stepping out of a borrowed life and reconnecting with your true self through the lens of Carl Jung. Each part is not meant to label right or wrong, but to help you recognize where you are on that journey. And pay special attention to part 9, because it is the place many people tend to avoid the most. Yet it is precisely where life begins to change direction, not through upheaval, but through a very quiet inner awakening. Number 1. When you are living okay, but no longer yourself. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But there is a very strange paradox. Many people live their entire lives without ever touching that privilege, not because they fail, not because they do something wrong, but because they live well enough. Well enough that no one has a reason to criticize them. Well enough that they themselves do not dare to stop and ask, "Who am I living for?" Life continues steadily, work gets done, responsibilities are fulfilled, and relationships maintain an appearance of calm. But somewhere inside, something quietly went out a long time ago, and you are no longer sure when you even noticed the moment it faded. Some people do not feel that their lives are bad. They are not in a major crisis. They have not suffered any serious loss. But if they are honest, they also do not feel alive. Each day passes more like a list of tasks to complete than an experience of true presence. They do exactly what they are supposed to do. Walk the path considered reasonable, safe, correct. And precisely because everything is so correct, there is no alarm loud enough to make them stop. When living in that state long enough, people begin to get used to not checking in with themselves anymore. When they are tired, they endure it. When they are bored, they tell themselves everyone feels that way. When they feel empty, they call it maturity. There are evenings when they lie down with no clearly sad story, but also no joy worth remembering. A very vague feeling, very hard to name. They only know that they are no longer excited about their own life. And because they do not know what to call it, they choose silence. Many people live in that state of how one should live, should try harder, should be considerate, should feel grateful, because they are still better off than many others, should stop asking for more. But the problem is not that you are ungrateful. The problem is that you have become used to pushing your real feelings aside just to keep everything looking fine. You do not allow yourself to be tired, because being tired seems weak. You do not allow yourself to be bored, because boredom seems ungrateful. And gradually, you no longer allow yourself to want anything different at all. The constant feeling of this state is not intense pain, but quiet erosion. You are not collapsing, but you are living in a state of slowly running dry without even being able to name it yourself. You are not crying, but the exhaustion inside has never truly been released. On the outside, you are still a normal person, perhaps even praised as stable, mature, and reliable. But on the inside, a part of you is so tired that it no longer wants to speak. Carl Jung believed that human beings can live for a very long time separated from their true self without realizing it, because they have learned to identify themselves with social roles. You no longer see yourself as a living, feeling, moving human being inside, but as a collection of roles to be fulfilled. A good employee, a proper child, a friend who does not cause trouble, a mature adult who knows how to control themselves. Those roles are not wrong, but when you live long enough only through roles, you begin to forget what it feels like to be yourself. This separation happens very quietly. There is no loud break, no shock strong enough to jolt you awake. It is like gradually no longer hearing a familiar sound, until you forget that you once heard it at all. You get used to waking up and doing what needs to be done. You get used to finishing each day without knowing how you actually feel. And then one day, when someone asks you a very simple question, not because the question is difficult, but because you have lost the habit of asking yourself that question. Some people go to work steadily for many years, but if you ask them what the feeling of being alive is, they are not sure they still remember. The job is not necessarily bad, it just no longer brings a sense of presence. The weekend is no longer something to look forward to, but just a short pause to recover for the next cycle. You sleep more, but do not feel rested. You take time off, but do not feel recharged. And there are mornings when you wake up and quietly ask yourself, where am I going? Then push the question aside because there is still too much to do. When living in that state, the most frightening thing is not that you suffer, but that you gradually accept emptiness as normal. You get used to having no answers to the big questions. You get used to living on autopilot, and because nothing is clearly wrong, you do not give yourself permission to stop and look deeper. Do you recognize yourself somewhere in these words? When was the last time you truly felt present in your life? A moment when you were doing something not to prove anything, not to complete something, not to meet expectations, but simply because you were there, fully with yourself? Or most of the time, are you just moving through your days as a chain of obligations linked together? You might say, everyone lives like that. And yes, many people do. But the fact that many people are tired does not make that tiredness disappear. The fact that many people are disconnected from themselves does not make it healthier. It only normalizes the distance. And it is this normalization that makes it hardest for people to return to themselves. What matters here is not that you must change immediately, not that you quit your job, cut off relationships, or turn your current life upside down. Those are often extreme reactions when people are too exhausted. But Jung was not talking about destroying everything. He was talking about returning, and returning always begins with a very small, very humble act, being honest with your own feelings. You do not need to have an immediate answer to the question, what do I want? But you can start by admitting, I am tired. No long explanations needed. No comparisons with others. No self-blame for being tired when everything is still fine. Just allow that feeling to exist without denying it. Because when you do not allow yourself to feel, you also do not allow yourself to live. You may feel uncomfortable doing this. Being honest about exhaustion often brings up questions you have avoided for a very long time. But that discomfort is precisely the sign that you are beginning to touch your true self again. Not to judge it, but to listen. And listening does not require you to act immediately. It only requires you to be present. You can begin with very small moments. An evening of doing nothing without guilt. A pause in the middle of the day to ask, how am I feeling right now? Are? One moment of not forcing yourself to be okay when inside you are not. These things do not solve everything, but they create space. And in that space, people begin to hear again the voice that has been drowned out for too long. Life has not disappeared from you. It has not gone anywhere. It is simply waiting for you to return. And perhaps the first step in the journey of finding yourself is not becoming someone else, but stopping long enough to realize how long you have been away from yourself. Number 2, the mask you have worn for so long that you forgot you were wearing it. And to live okay like that, people often have to learn a skill very early on, knowing how to become a version of themselves that others find easy to be around. At first, these are only small adjustments, speaking a little less to avoid conflict, being a little more easygoing so no one feels uncomfortable, swallowing a disagreement out of fear that the atmosphere might turn tense. At the beginning, these adjustments seem harmless. They are even praised as tactful, mature, and considerate. But over time, they accumulate, stacking layer upon layer, until you can no longer tell where you end and where the version you present to keep everything peaceful begins. Many people live their entire lives with the sense that they are easy to deal with. They always behave properly, always know how to be considerate, and always play the understanding one in every relationship. They know when to stay quiet, when to give in, when to smile things away. And because they do this so well, few people notice the price they pay for that smoothness, the loss of connection with themselves. When you constantly prioritize other people's emotions over your own, you gradually get used to putting yourself second, not because you have no needs, but because you are afraid your needs might inconvenience someone. You are afraid of being seen as difficult, selfish, or not mature enough. The biggest fear is not losing the relationship but being judged negatively within it. And so you learn to self-adjust, to shrink yourself, to make yourself fit other people's expectations. What is worth noting is that this process rarely happens through obvious pain. It unfolds through very small, everyday choices. You say, okay, while your heart wants to refuse. You nod even though your mind is full of doubts. You smile to avoid trouble, even though that smile does not come from joy. Each time, you tell yourself, it's fine, it's a small thing. But these small things, when added together, create a very large distance between you and yourself. Carl Jung called this phenomenon the persona. He wrote, "The persona is that which, in reality, one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is." The persona is the social version that a person builds to be accepted. It is not fake in a negative sense. It is a very natural, adaptive mechanism. People need a persona to live in society, to integrate, to avoid being excluded. But the problem begins when you live with the persona for so long that you start to believe you are it. At that point, you no longer ask, "How do I feel?" but only, "What will others think?" You stop listening to your inner responses and prioritize keeping the surface calm. Gradually, you may please many people, but you no longer feel truly present in any relationship. You are there, but not whole. You speak, but not what you truly think. You smile, but you are not sure you are happy. In everyday life, this shows up very clearly. You take on more work even when you are already overwhelmed, simply because you do not want to disappoint others. You stay in a conversation that exhausts you because you fear leaving early will make you seem cold. You agree with a group decision even when it goes against your inner sense, because you do not want to be the difficult one. On the outside, everything looks harmonious. On the inside, you gradually lose connection with yourself. There is a very specific kind of exhaustion that belongs to people who have lived with a social mask for a long time. It is not the exhaustion of working too much, but the exhaustion of constant self-control. Controlling your words, controlling your reactions, controlling your emotions, even controlling thoughts the moment they arise, out of fear that they might be inappropriate. You are not collapsing, but you are living in a state of slowly running dry without being able to name it yourself. You are not crying, but the fatigue inside has never truly been released. The irony is that the more you live this way, the more you are praised as doing fine. Others trust you, rely on you, see you as easy to talk to, easy to work with. But few people ask whether you are actually okay. And if they do ask, you are very good at answering, "I'm fine." That answer gradually becomes a reflex, even another role you know by heart. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, are you living to be liked or to be yourself? If one day you did not need to please anyone, did not need to maintain an image, did not need to prove that you are easy to be around, would you behave differently? Would you speak differently? Would you say no more often? Or would you allow yourself to be quiet without feeling guilty? Jung did not believe the persona was something that needed to be eliminated. He understood clearly that people cannot live outside of society. The issue is not whether you have a mask or not, but whether you are aware that you are wearing it. When you confuse the persona with your true self, you begin trading outer calm for inner distance. And that distance, if prolonged, can make you feel as though you are living someone else's life. The solution here is not to remove the mask immediately. That is neither realistic nor helpful. You do not need to become harsh, confrontational, or indifferent to prove that you are real. What you need first is awareness. Noticing the moments when you nod while wanting to shake your head. Noticing when you smile just to keep the peace. Noticing the slight discomfort that appears each time you place yourself second. From that awareness, you can begin with very small boundaries. Very small. One moment of allowing yourself to say, "Let me think about it." One moment of not replying immediately when you are not ready. One moment of leaving early from a meeting that drains you, without having to explain too much. These small boundaries do not make you selfish. They simply help you remember that you, too, are a human being with needs, limits, and feelings that deserve respect. At first, this may feel unfamiliar, even anxiety-provoking, because when you are used to being the easy one, any change can be misunderstood as selfishness. But the truth is, you are not wrong for wanting to be accepted. The desire to be liked is deeply human. The loss only happens when you trade your true self for surface-level peace. Life does not require you to always be easy. Life only invites you to be present, and you cannot truly be present if you are always performing. The mask may help you fit in, but it cannot live your life for you. If you have worn it for so long that you forgot you were wearing it, then the first thing you need to do is not to take it off, but to remember, beneath it, there is still a person waiting to return. Number 3. What you hate in others is often what you are rejecting in yourself. But the mask does not always work smoothly. There are very strange moments when you suddenly feel irritated by someone who has done nothing wrong. You react strongly to things that seem very small. A careless remark, a way of behaving that is not directed at you, yet it makes you feel annoyed, tense, even hurt more deeply than you think is reasonable. You wonder why you are so harsh, why something so trivial can shake your emotions so intensely. And often, you cannot find a reasonable answer at all. These reactions do not come from logic. If you sit down and analyze it, you know very clearly that the other person did nothing wrong. You know you are overreacting, but emotions do not follow logic. They rise quickly, vividly, and leave behind a lingering sense of discomfort. You may stay silent, but inside you are scrutinizing, judging, and even feeling contempt. And what confuses you most is this: you do not understand why you are like this. Certain types of people trigger you much more strongly than others. Not everyone irritates you in the same way. There are people you dislike simply by being around them, even though they have not done anything specific. Some people only need to say a few words for you to want to withdraw. There are people who make you lose patience very quickly, while with others, you are extremely tolerant. These reactions often come before thought. You dislike them before you even understand why you dislike them. And then you begin to label them. You call them fake, weak, loud, showy, selfish, and inconsiderate. These labels help you feel justified in keeping your distance. But if you are honest, you will also notice that these labels carry a great deal of personal emotion. They are not merely objective observations. They contain tension, an irritation that has not been explained. Carl Jung called this phenomenon the shadow. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." The shadow is not the bad part in a moral sense. It is the collection of aspects of yourself that you were once required to suppress, hide, or reject to be accepted. These parts do not disappear. They are simply pushed out of consciousness, and when they are not acknowledged, they find ways to appear indirectly, most often through how you perceive them in other people. Put simply, what you do not allow yourself to be is what you are most likely to feel uncomfortable seeing in others. If you were taught to always think of others first, you may feel irritated by people who live for themselves. If you were criticized for being weak when you expressed emotion, you may feel aversion toward those who complain or are easily hurt. If you were constantly reminded to be humble, to know your place, you may strongly resent people who are confident, expressive, and willing to speak about their achievements, not because they are doing something wrong, but because they are living out parts that you learned to forbid within yourself. These reactions often make you feel ashamed if you look at them directly, because you do not want to think of yourself as narrow-minded or judgmental. You may tell yourself that you are simply not compatible with that type of person. But if you pay close attention, you will notice that your emotion goes beyond mere incompatibility. It has intensity. It has rigidity. It robs you of empathy. And that is a sign that something deeper is being touched. In everyday life, this appears very clearly. Someone does nothing directly to you, but every time they post about their personal achievements, you feel irritated. You may say they are showing off, but more deeply, perhaps you have never allowed yourself to feel proud of what you have accomplished. Someone often talks about their sadness, and you feel exhausted, annoyed. You may think they are weak, but perhaps you have long been accustomed to swallowing your own sadness and not allowing yourself to complain. Someone lives very freely, makes decisions based on their feelings, and you see them as impulsive and irresponsible. But that may be because you have lived within rigid structures for too long and never dared to do the same. This is how the shadow works. It does not appear directly within you, but shows up as a reflection in others. And because you do not recognize it as your own, you believe the problem lies entirely with them. You dislike them, avoid them, or judge them, without realizing that you are reacting to something very familiar within yourself. There is an important point here. This does not mean that every uncomfortable reaction comes from the shadow. Not every behavior from others needs to be accepted or justified. Some behaviors are genuinely inappropriate or harmful and require clear boundaries. Jung did not say that you must tolerate or rationalize everything. What he emphasized was the need to distinguish between healthy reactions and reactions rooted in projection. The way to tell the difference often lies in the intensity of the emotion. If the other person has done nothing clearly wrong, yet you react very strongly, very quickly, and with little control, that is the moment to pause and ask yourself. Not to blame yourself, but to understand. Because excessive reactions are often signals of something not yet made conscious. Have you ever asked yourself, if that person did nothing wrong, why am I reacting so strongly? Is there something in them that you were once forbidden to be? Is there a part of you that feels threatened, exposed, or reminded of something? These questions are not easy to answer. They require you to return to old memories, rules, and teachings that you internalized very early on. Perhaps you were taught not to be selfish, not to show off, not to be weak, not to stand out, not to make others uncomfortable. These do-nots helped you survive and be accepted at a certain stage of life. But when you carry them throughout your entire life, they become barriers between you and your true self. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." 1. Working with the shadow is not about becoming more positive or forcing yourself to think well of everyone. It is about daring to look directly at your uncomfortable reactions without immediately denying or justifying them. When you become curious about your own reactions, instead of focusing only on others' behavior, you open a very important door on the journey back to yourself. The solution here is not that you must immediately change how you see others. You do not need to force yourself to like people you dislike. You do not need to be close to everyone. What is needed is honest curiosity. Which part of me is being touched when I react like this? This question is not meant to conclude, but to open. It shifts your attention from the outside to the inside, where the reaction truly originates. You can begin very simply. The next time you notice yourself feeling irritated by someone, acknowledge that feeling without rushing to judge it. There is no need to analyze it immediately. Just recognize, I am reacting strongly. Later, when there is space, gently ask yourself again, not to blame yourself, but to understand. You may not have an answer right away, but simply stopping and not projecting all your emotions onto the other person is already a very significant step. When you begin to become familiar with your own shadow, you will notice something different. The people who once irritated you the most are often those who carry the most important messages. Not because they are good or bad, but because they reflect something you need to see. When the rejected part is acknowledged, your reactions soften. Not because the other person changes, but because you are no longer fighting against yourself. The shadow is not the enemy. It does not come to destroy you. It comes to remind you that there are parts of you that have been neglected for too long. And the journey of finding yourself cannot be complete if you only embrace the light while continuing to turn away from the darkness. When you are brave enough to look back at what you once hated, avoided, and judged, you do not become weaker. You become more whole. Life begins to change not when you become someone else, but when you no longer have to run from the parts of yourself that were once forbidden. And sometimes, the path back to your true self begins very quietly, in the moment you realize that what irritates you most in others may be the deepest invitation to return to yourself. If you have made it this far, thank you for taking the time to listen and stay with these uncomfortable questions. Not everyone has the patience to look back at their own reactions, and the fact that you are still here is already a rare sign of honesty. If you feel this content has value, please share it with someone who might need to hear it, or simply press like to let us know you are here with us. And now, take a short breath, because right after this, we will move together into number 4, where you will begin to see more clearly the quiet inner struggle taking place within you between the desire to change and the fear of leaving what is familiar. Number 4, you want to change, but a part of you does not. Once you begin to recognize your own reactions, something else quietly appears. You know you need to change. You can clearly see that something is no longer right. You may even be able to name it. But every time you are about to take a step forward, some part of you pulls you back to the old place, not with shouting, not with panic, but with reasons that sound very reasonable, very ordinary, and very hard to argue against. It is not because you lack courage. It is not because you do not want to live differently. It is because there is a real inner struggle taking place inside you. One part wants to move forward. One part wants to stay. And both of these parts are trying to protect you, each in their own way. You know you need to be different. You know that if you keep going like this, you will slowly run dry. But every time you think about changing, you delay it. Not through laziness, but through arguments that sound very convincing. Not the right time yet. I'll do it when things are more stable. It's not that bad right now. These statements sound reasonable. Thanks for watching. 100 problems something to climb, and 100 batted, with pros, and 100 pie. And precisely because they sound reasonable, they keep you where you are for a very long time. You do not deny the need for change. You simply keep postponing it to another moment. A moment when you believe you will be more ready, more grounded, less at risk. But that moment keeps moving further away. And you begin to live in an in-between state, no longer truly wanting to stay, yet not daring to leave. Carl Jung described this state as an inner conflict between two opposing forces. One force wants growth, expansion, movement toward the unknown. The other wants safety, maintenance of what is familiar, and protection of the structures that once helped you survive. Jung once wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown." This means that you cannot always solve this conflict through logic. You cannot reason the fearful part out of existence, because that part exists to keep you safe. It remembers the times you were hurt, failed, or lost something important. And every time you are about to step into something new, it shows up to remind you, last time it was like this, and you were not okay. So hesitation is not always weakness. Sometimes, it is a form of self-protection. The problem is not that you are afraid. The problem is when you allow that fear to hold full authority over your life. You can see this very clearly in everyday choices. Some people want to leave their job because they have been exhausted for a long time. They know that the environment no longer fits them. But every time they think about leaving, the fear of losing stability appears. Not the fear of poverty, but the fear of losing the familiar framework that has defined who they are for many years. Some people want to speak honestly in a relationship. They know that silence is slowly distancing them from themselves. But every time they are about to speak, They fear hurting the other person, fear breaking the image of being easy to be around that they have maintained for so long, and so they choose silence once again. Others want to live differently. They want to slow down. They want to choose a less flashy path, but they fear losing their old image. They fear no longer being recognized by others. They fear being asked, "Why are you so different lately?" And they stay, not because they feel okay, but because they are not ready to say goodbye to the familiar version of themselves. So, what is it that you are afraid of? Are you afraid of failure? Or are you afraid of losing a version of yourself that you have been attached to for a very long time? Are you afraid of something new? Or are you afraid of the feeling of no longer knowing who you are when you are not clinging to the old? Many people believe that to change, they need to be braver, stronger, and more decisive. But Jung did not emphasize forcing oneself. He did not encourage crushing fear to move forward. On the contrary, he saw respecting fear as an important part of the maturation process. The solution here is not to force yourself to make a big leap, not to cut everything off and start over completely. It is to begin with very small changes. Changes that you know you could return from if needed. Not so that you actually return, but so that the fearful part inside you feels heard. Instead of forcing yourself to quit your job immediately, you might begin by being more honest with your sense of exhaustion. Instead of saying everything that has been building up inside, you might begin with one small sentence, just enough so that you are not betraying yourself. Instead of changing your entire life, you might give yourself small pockets of time that are truly yours, where you can live at your own pace, even if only briefly. When you do not crush your fear, fear does not need to fight against you. When you allow it to exist, it no longer needs to control you from behind the scenes. And then, the part of you that wants to grow finally has space to speak, not through explosions, but through very real steps. Maturity is not the absence of fear. Maturity is recognizing that fear is not the enemy, but it is also not the guide. You can carry it with you, listen to it, but you do not have to hand over the right to decide your life to it. And perhaps the biggest change does not come from how fast you move, but from the moment you stop betraying yourself in very small ways. When you begin choosing yourself, even just a little, life slowly starts to shift in directions you never imagined. Number 5. When you live only by reason or only by emotion, this inner struggle is usually not loud. It does not appear as a clear crisis, but quietly weaves itself into the way you live each day. You lean entirely to one side. Either you are always in control, always strong, always rational, never allowing yourself to be weak. Or, on the other hand, you live completely through emotion, easily swayed, easily dependent, and struggling to make decisions. On the outside, you still look like a person who is doing fine, but inside, there is a part of you that has been left behind for a very long time, and that very part is quietly creating conflict. Some people live almost entirely by reason. They are used to analyzing everything, calculating pros and cons, and tightly controlling their emotions. They rarely cry, rarely show vulnerability, and often take pride in their ability to stay strong. They know what they should do, what makes sense, and what is reasonable. But in exchange, they find it very hard to admit that they are tired. When they feel sad, they try to explain it away. When they are in pain, they try to endure it. Emotions become something to be managed, rather than something to be listened to. On the opposite side, some people live very much through emotion. They are sensitive, easily moved, and easily hurt. They are keenly aware of small changes in relationships, in glances, in tones of voice. But when it comes time to make decisions, they hesitate. They fear being wrong, fear disappointing others, and fear the consequences. They easily doubt themselves, and often need validation from the outside to feel at ease. Emotions guide them, but also exhaust them. No matter which side you lean toward, the common thread is often a sense of inner conflict. One part of you wants control, another longs to let go. One part wants safety, another wants to live truthfully. You may not be able to name this conflict, but you feel the prolonged tension very clearly. It shows up as always having to brace yourself, or always feeling uncertain, you rarely feel whole. Carl Jung saw this conflict very clearly and called it an imbalance between anima and animus. Jung wrote, "The anima and animus should function as a bridge or a door that leads to the collective unconscious." Anima and animus are not concepts of gender in the ordinary sense. They represent two psychological energies: emotion, intuition, the ability to connect with the inner world, and reason, structure, the ability to act and decide. When one of these is suppressed for too long, a person begins to live out of balance. Overly rational people often learned very early that vulnerability was dangerous. They may have been criticized for being sensitive, abandoned when they showed emotion, or forced to toughen up to survive. They learned to be strong because it was the only way to feel safe. But the cost is losing connection with their true feelings. They do not allow themselves to cry, do not allow themselves to be weak, and gradually do not allow themselves to need anyone. Overly emotional people often grew up with a different kind of insecurity. They may have been neglected, not trusted, or made to doubt themselves. They learned to rely on emotions and on other people's reactions to navigate life. But because they were not encouraged to develop decisiveness, they struggle to stand firmly. They fear making mistakes, fear responsibility, and easily lose themselves in relationships. In everyday life, this imbalance becomes very visible. Some people cannot cry, even when they are deeply hurt, because they fear that once they allow themselves to be weak, they will lose control. Some people cannot make any major decisions because they fear that choosing wrongly will bring unbearable consequences. Some people constantly doubt themselves, even though on the outside, they appear very stable or very caring. You may recognize yourself in very small moments. When something painful happens, you immediately tell yourself, "It's fine, think positively," instead of allowing yourself to feel sad. When you need to make a decision, you ask everyone around you, yet still feel uneasy with your own choice. When emotions arise, you either suppress them immediately or are completely swept away by them. Very rarely do you feel both emotionally present and grounded at the same time. This does not mean that you are wrong. It simply shows that you had to sacrifice a part of yourself to survive, and that sacrifice once had its reasons. But when it lasts too long, it causes you to live as only half a person, not because you lack ability, but because you do not allow your whole self to be present. Have you ever asked yourself which part of yourself you had to reject to survive? How strong did you have to become so that you would not have to feel pain? Or how accustomed did you become to living through emotion so that you would not have to take responsibility for your choices? These questions are not comfortable. They touch very deep places where you once had to adapt to be loved or to be safe. But Jung believed that people only truly mature when they dare to look back at what they have left behind. He wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries." Wholeness does not come from eliminating a part of yourself, but from allowing opposing parts to coexist. The solution here is not to search for a state of perfect balance. That is neither realistic nor helpful. You do not need to become perfectly rational and perfectly emotional. What you need is simply to allow the part that has been rejected to exist, even if only in private, even if only with yourself. If you are someone who lives too much by reason, you might begin by allowing yourself to feel without needing to explain. An evening where you let yourself be sad without finding a logical reason. One moment of admitting to yourself that you need comfort. No one else needs to know. You just need to stop denying it. If you are someone who lives too much by emotion, you might begin by making small decisions without asking for anyone's opinion. A very simple choice that you take responsibility for yourself. Not to prove that you are strong, but to give the decisive part of you a chance to breathe. These steps may feel unfamiliar. That is because they go against the way you have lived for a long time. But that very unfamiliarity is a sign that you are touching the parts that were left behind. And every time you allow a rejected part to emerge, you move closer to wholeness. You are not lacking anything. You do not need to become someone else. You simply have not yet lived your full self. Life begins to change not when you choose to live more rationally or more emotionally, but when you stop fighting half of yourself. When reason is no longer armor hiding fear, and emotion is no longer a refuge from responsibility, you begin to live as a whole human being, and perhaps that is the moment you truly return to yourself. Number 6. The greatest illusion. I know who I am. And then, to live with all of those inner contradictions, people often cling to something that seems very solid, a story about themselves. I'm just that kind of person. I've always been this way. That kind of thing just isn't for me. Those statements sound clear, even comforting. They help you know who you are, where you belong, what you should do, and what you should not do. But there is something rarely mentioned. Sometimes, these very stories that seem so clear are exactly what keep you stuck the longest. People tend to define themselves by what is familiar, their past, their profession, their social roles, what has happened to them, and what has been recognized. You are someone who does that job, lives in that environment, and has gone through those experiences. These pieces come together to form a coherent story of me. And when that story has been told long enough, repeated often enough, it begins to hold power. You don't just tell it to others. You tell it to yourself whenever you stand in front of a new possibility. At a certain level, this is very natural. A personal narrative gives you a sense of continuity, of roots. But the problem begins when you cling to that story so tightly that you fear anything that might change it. You are afraid to try a different path because that's not who I am. You are afraid to change the way you live because I've always been like this. You are afraid to step out of a familiar role because if you are no longer that role, you no longer know who you are. This fear is usually quiet. It doesn't appear as panic, but as a gentle closing. Each time an opportunity for change arises, you automatically find reasons to turn it down. Each time a new desire emerges, you quickly label it unrealistic, inappropriate, or not aligned with who you are. And then you return to the old story, feeling safe, yet also sensing that you are missing something you cannot quite name. Many people are trapped in stories like this. It's not that they don't want to change. They simply don't dare to change, because change means facing the hardest question of all. If I'm no longer who I used to be, then who am I? Number 1. I missens and unrhymes. And for many, not having an answer to that question is more frightening than living in a familiar sense of incompleteness. Carl Jung saw this trap very clearly. He distinguished between the ego and the self. Jung wrote, "The ego is the center of consciousness, but not the center of the personality. The ego is the structure that allows you to function in everyday life. It is necessary. It helps you orient yourself, make decisions, and keep life orderly. But the ego is not the whole of who you are. The self is much larger. It includes unrealized possibilities, unnamed parts, directions you have never dared to explore. When you mistake the ego for your entire being, you begin to live inside a very subtle illusion, the illusion that you already know exactly who you are. And once you believe you know, you stop exploring. You stop listening to new signals from within. You reject impulses toward change simply because they don't fit the old image. In daily life, this shows up clearly in the language you use about yourself. I'm not that kind of person. I can't do that. I've always been this way. I can't change. These statements are not always wrong, but they are often used as doors that close, rather than honest descriptions. They help you avoid trying, avoid failing, and avoid uncertainty, and in exchange, you also avoid the possibility of growth. There is a difficult truth to face. Many of the limits you believe are your personality are actually just habits. Many things you think are your nature are in fact reactions formed in a certain context, at a certain stage of your life. They once had a reason to exist. They once helped you adapt, but what was necessary in the past does not have to define you forever. Jung did not see the ego as an enemy. He understood that people need the ego to live. But he warned that when the ego monopolizes the definition of who you are, it becomes the greatest obstacle on the path of individuation. When you fully identify with an old story, there is no room left for becoming. You only repeat. Have you ever asked yourself, if you were not bound by your old story, how would you live differently? If you did not have to maintain a familiar image, what would you try? If you did not need to prove that, this is who I am, how would you allow yourself to change? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They simply invite you to realize that perhaps you don't need to protect your old story so fiercely. That changing does not mean betraying yourself. Sometimes it simply means moving closer to a larger version of who you are. Many people fear change because they believe it means losing their identity. Jung saw it the opposite way. He believed that people do not lose themselves by changing. They lose themselves only when they stop becoming. When you insist on holding onto a fixed image of yourself, you freeze a process that is meant to stay alive. The solution here is not to destroy the ego. You do not need to deny your past, your profession, or the roles that shaped who you are today. Those things still have value. The only thing is not to let them have exclusive authority over who you are. Do not let an old version decide all future possibilities. You can begin very gently. Instead of saying, I am this kind of person, try saying, I tend to be this way. Instead of, I can't change, try, I don't yet know how I might change. Small shifts in how you speak about yourself can open vast inner spaces. They remind you that you are not a fixed entity, but a process in motion. Allowing yourself to be in the process of becoming is an act of courage. It requires accepting uncertainty. It requires living without clinging too tightly to familiar labels. But in return, it brings a very different feeling. The feeling of living in alignment with your inner movement, rather than being trapped in an outdated image. You do not need to go far to find yourself. You do not need to create an entirely new identity. Perhaps all you need is to stop abandoning yourself each time a new part wants to speak. To stop denying small changes just because they feel unfamiliar. To stop treating differences as a threat. Life does not demand that you know exactly who you are at every moment. It only invites you to be honest enough to listen to who you are becoming. And when you allow yourself to live in that state of becoming, you may realize something very gentle. You were never truly lost. You only need to loosen your grip on the illusion that you already know everything about yourself, so that you can meet the larger self that is waiting ahead. If you have walked through this journey to this point, you may already be noticing that knowing who you are is not as simple as a fixed answer. The 6 sections so far have only helped reveal what has been obscuring the self. But according to Carl Jung, the path of return goes even deeper. And in the next 3 sections, we will step together into more challenging layers of awareness, where life stops repeating itself, crisis is no longer misunderstood, and finding yourself begins to take on a very different meaning. Number 7. Life begins when you choose to return. But what if the ego you are clinging to is only a temporary version? What if finding yourself is not about becoming someone else, but about stopping the escape from the parts of you that were once left behind? Perhaps life does not begin at a major milestone. It does not begin when you become more successful, more knowledgeable, or more recognized. It begins in a very quiet moment. The moment you are honest enough to turn back and ask, what have I been neglecting all this time? The journey of returning does not look like a dramatic transformation. It does not make you appear more perfect in the eyes of others. It does not suddenly make life easier. But it does something deeply important. It helps you stop betraying yourself. You no longer have to strain to become a reasonable version of who you should be. You no longer have to convince yourself that everything is fine while inside you are exhausted. You begin to live more truthfully, even when that truth is uncomfortable. This new state is not radiant happiness. It is steadiness. You still get tired. You still doubt yourself. You still have days when you don't know where you are going. But there is a clear difference. You no longer abandon your emotions the moment they appear. You no longer turn away from your intuition just because it doesn't sound logical. You no longer force yourself into rigid molds just to keep the peace. As you begin to return, you realize that you no longer need to prove so much, not because you lack value, but because you no longer derive your value from external approval. You slowly stop living in reaction mode. You stop pleasing. You stop chasing standards that drain you. You are not more perfect, but you are more present in your own life. Carl Jung called this process individuation. He wrote, "Individuation means becoming a single, homogeneous being, and, insofar as individuality, embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness. It also implies becoming one's own self. Individuation, according to Jung, is not about becoming someone else. It is the process of becoming whole. Wholeness does not mean the absence of contradiction. It means you no longer deny the opposing parts within you. When you choose to return, you begin to allow yourself to do things that were once forbidden, not in rebellion, but in quiet honesty. You dare to say no without guilt. Not because you are selfish, but because you know where your limits are. You dare to choose uncertainty, not because you are reckless, but because you no longer want to live a life so safe that it feels empty. You dare to slow down, not because you are incapable, but because you need to hear yourself again. From the outside, these changes are often very small. Others may not notice them right away, but inside, you feel them clearly. Each time you speak honestly, instead of just saying what's expected, each time you pause before nodding off out of habit, each time you choose what aligns with you, even if it doesn't please everyone, these are moments of return. Returning does not mean cutting off relationships or responsibilities. It does not require you to leave your current life. It only asks that you change your position within that life. From someone constantly chasing expectations, you become present and listening. From someone living by roles, you begin living by felt experience. From someone trying to be right, you begin allowing yourself to be real. You may notice this in very ordinary moments. You no longer feel the need to over-explain your choices. You no longer feel compelled to justify your emotions. You can be alone without feeling empty. And when you are with others, you no longer have to strain to maintain an image. And now, a very important question appears. Not a question to analyze, but a question to feel. If today you didn't have to prove anything, how would you live? If you didn't need to please anyone, didn't need to maintain familiar roles, didn't need to protect an old story, what would you choose for yourself? You might feel afraid when you think about that question, because it opens into the unknown. But it is precisely this unknown that holds real life. Jung believed that the unknown is not an enemy, but the space where human growth takes place. When you dare to step into it, you do not lose yourself. You meet yourself at a deeper level. The final solution does not lie in changing the world around you. It lies in how you treat yourself. Self-respect is not selfishness. Self-respect is the ability to recognize your own worth without diminishing others. Boundaries are not distance. Boundaries are how you keep relationships from costing you yourself. And returning to your true being is not a one-time decision. It is a long journey, sometimes forward, sometimes back, but increasingly honest. There will be days when you unconsciously fall back into old habits, still pleasing when you don't want to, still staying silent when you need to speak. That does not mean you have failed. It only means you are learning. Each time you notice that you've drifted away from yourself and gently return, you are strengthening the path back. Life does not begin when you become better. It does not begin when all your wounds are healed. It does not begin when you become some ideal version of yourself. Life begins when you stop abandoning your true being, when you stay with your emotions, stay with your inner truth, even when it is unfinished. Stay with the person you are becoming, instead of clinging to the person you once were. And perhaps this is the deepest reminder Jung offers. You do not need to go far to find yourself. You only need to pause long enough, honestly enough, to realize that your true self was never gone. It has simply been waiting for you to return. Number 8. Why do you keep repeating the same kind of pain? There is a deeply uncomfortable paradox that many people only dare to admit when they are completely alone. It is that you are not lacking in self-awareness. You have read, listened, and reflected a great deal. You know which masks you once wore, which parts of yourself you denied, how your ego once took the lead. You understand why you were hurt in the past. And yet, somehow, life still brings you back to the very same old story. It is still the same type of person, still the same feeling, still the same disappointment. Only the names change, the circumstances change, but the rhythm of the pain remains almost identical. At times, you find yourself asking, "Why don't I ever make a new mistake?" The question sounds ironic, but inside, it carries a very real exhaustion. Because what drains you is not a lack of progress, but the fact that you keep reliving a lesson you thought you had already learned long ago. And when you cannot find a reasonable explanation, you turn the blame on yourself. You tell yourself that you must not be aware enough, not strong enough, not wise enough. But perhaps the problem does not lie in a lack of understanding. Perhaps it lies in an unconscious loyalty to a familiar pain. Some people always fall in love with the same type of person. They may change environments, change their approach, even change their stated standards. But when they enter a real relationship, they are still drawn to the same personality type. Cold, elusive, emotionally distant. And once again, they step into their familiar role, waiting, hoping, trying just a little harder. Some people always end up in the role of the one who gives more. No one forces them. They volunteer. They feel valuable when they are needed. But the more they give, the smaller they feel. And when the relationship ends, they carry the same old question with them. Why am I always the one who gets left behind? Some people move through many environments, many relationships, yet the feeling of not being recognized is always there. They do well. They make an effort. But recognition either comes too late or never comes at all. And inside them is a quiet exhaustion. Is it that I am simply not worthy of being chosen? What is striking is that these people are not naive. On the contrary, they are highly sensitive. They often sense early on that they are entering a familiar situation. They can partly predict the outcome, yet they still move forward. Not because they enjoy pain, but because there is a feeling that is very hard to name, pulling them to stay. A feeling so familiar that it feels safe, even though it is not pleasant. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." What Jung meant here is not that your life is controlled by some external force. Rather, there are inner scripts formed very early, operating quietly, repeating themselves until you truly see them. The unconscious does not seek happiness first. It seeks familiarity. What is familiar, even if painful, feels safer than what has never been touched. A familiar pain has a map. You know where it will hurt, when it will hurt, and how it will hurt. That creates a false sense of control. Meanwhile, the unknown, even if it may be healthier, leaves you feeling unanchored because there is nothing to hold on to. That is why the unconscious tends to recreate old circumstances, not to punish you, but to complete an experience that was never fully resolved. This is not destiny. This is a script running again because it has never truly been stopped. Think of someone who always loves emotionally cold people. Very likely, their childhood was marked by the feeling of having to strive to be noticed. Affection did not come naturally. It had to be earned. As an adult, this no longer feels strange. It feels familiar. And that familiarity is mistakenly called love. Or think of someone who is always in the role of the rescuer. They are excellent listeners, very good at staying when others are weak. But deep down, they were only loved when they were useful, when they were strong, when they did not cause trouble. So they continue to choose relationships that need saving, because that is where they know how to exist. Some people are accustomed to being overlooked, not because they are incapable, but because they have lived too long in a state of waiting for recognition. They are used to making an effort first and being seen later. And when a relationship or environment recreates that exact feeling, they step into it naturally, as if returning to a familiar place. They are not choosing pain. They are choosing what is familiar to survive. And here, there is a very important question you may have never asked yourself. Which pain in your life is so familiar that you no longer question it? Are you seeking love, or are you trying to repair an old memory through a new person? What are you hoping will be different when the role you are playing remains the same? If this time is not about winning, the old story, if this time is not about proving that you will finally be chosen, loved, allowed to stay, would you dare to step away? Stepping away here does not mean cutting everything off. It does not mean declaring that you have awakened. and it does not mean changing your entire life overnight. What Jung points to is never an extreme confrontation. It is awareness. Awareness of the role you are playing in the loop. Awareness that this role once helped you survive, but it is no longer suitable for living. And when you notice that you are entering a situation that feels just like last time, instead of rushing in with the hope that this time will be different, you stop. Just stop. You do not try to fix others. You do not punish yourself. You do not overanalyze. You simply choose not to reenact the old pain one more time. At first, you may feel empty because without the old role, you do not yet know who you are. But that emptiness is not failure. It is the first space where a new life can enter. You are not weak because you repeat patterns. You are simply loyal to what once helped you survive during a time when you had no other choice. But you are no longer there. You no longer need to survive. You need to live. And when you stop trying to be loved within an old story, when you stop trying to repair a memory through new people, the life you thought you were searching for outside may begin to open from within. Number 9. When life pushes you into crisis, it is not the wrong path. There are phases in life that you do not know how to name. You are no longer the person you used to be, but you also cannot yet say who you have become. The things that once excited you gradually lose their color. The choices that once felt clear now become vague. You still live, still function, still fulfill your responsibilities. But inside, there is a strange feeling, as if you have left a familiar place without having arrived anywhere new. You begin to doubt yourself. Are you becoming weaker? Are you falling behind? Did you do something wrong that led you into this state? And then a quiet but heavy question appears, not loudly, yet persistently. Is this a crisis? Or is this a transitional phase that you were never taught how to move through? This state does not arrive violently. It is not a collapse. It feels more like a gradual withdrawal of life energy. You no longer feel motivated by what once mattered. The goals that used to pull you out of bed each morning no longer have enough force. You are not exactly sad, but not happy either. Not exactly hopeless, yet you cannot find hope. A silent emptiness opens inside you, and you do not know what to fill it with. The emotions that accompany this state are often deeply uncomfortable. Anxiety, because you do not know where you are going. Confusion, because you no longer recognize yourself. And deeper still, a very real fear. The fear that you are regressing, that you are losing what you have built, that if you do not quickly become okay again, you will be left behind. But the most dangerous thing in this phase is not the emptiness. It is the reflex to force yourself back into your old self, simply because you are afraid of not knowing who you are without it. You try to push yourself back into a familiar rhythm. You force yourself to feel excited again. You force yourself to find new goals, new plans, new passions. You try to fix this feeling as quickly as possible, as if it were an error that needs to be corrected. Carl Jung saw this phenomenon in a completely different way. He did not view a crisis as a sign of failure or pathology. He saw it as a necessary part of psychological development. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." According to Jung, there are phases in life when an old psychological structure has completed its role. The ego you once relied on to live, to survive, to adapt, is no longer wide enough to contain the person you are becoming. And when that happens, the unconscious begins to withdraw energy from that old structure. What once gave you meaning gradually loses its pull. Not to punish you, but to force you to stop. This is not a collapse. This is a necessary dissolution. One ego must die for the self to have space to appear, and this death is rarely loud. It usually unfolds in silence, through exhaustion, through emptiness, through the sense that you no longer want to continue living as you once did. Jung saw this as a profound process of psychological reorganization. Not everyone goes through it, and not everyone who goes through it realizes what they are experiencing. Many mistake it for failure. Many panic and return to the old path, simply to avoid the unknown. But those who are brave enough to stay, even without answers, begin to touch a different level of living. You can see this clearly in crises that follow success. Some people achieve what they dreamed of for many years: position, money, recognition. But once they reach it, they feel empty, no motivation, no joy, and they dare not say it out loud, for fear of being seen as ungrateful or weak. Yet the truth is that the ego that brought them to that success has completed its task, and now it is no longer enough. Midlife crises, often around the ages of 30 to 40, carry a similar tone. You no longer want to live by old standards. Definitions of success, stability, or a proper life no longer reassure you. But you also do not yet know what you want instead. You stand between two worlds, one that is familiar but no longer true, and one that is unknown but calling to you in a very vague way. Major breakdowns can also push you into this state. A relationship ends, a major event occurs, and you realize you cannot go back to how things were, not because you do not want to, but because the old version of you no longer exists. And the most painful part is not the external loss, but having to say goodbye to a version of yourself you were attached to for a very long time. What all these states have in common is not a loss of direction. It is the end of the old road. And when the old road ends, forcing yourself to keep running only exhausts you further. So what if this phase is not meant to be fixed, but to be released? What if you do not need answers right now, but simply need to stay with the questions? What are you more afraid of? The unknown, or no longer being your old self? Are you trying to become okay again to satisfy someone else? Or do you need to change form to continue living more truthfully? The solution Jung suggests is never to force speed. He does not encourage rushing to find a new passion, a new goal, or a new identity to replace the old one. On the contrary, he emphasizes the importance of staying in the transitional phase, allowing yourself not to know, allowing yourself to have no answers, allowing yourself to be inefficient for a while. This is extremely difficult in a world that constantly pushes you to move forward, to be clear, to succeed. But psychological reorganization does not follow the rhythm of society. It has its own pace. And if you try to drag yourself back into the old rhythm when the old structure has already dissolved, you only prolong the pain. The practice in this phase does not need to be complicated. Slow down. Observe. Notice what no longer fits you, instead of rushing to find what comes next. Allow unproductive days. Allow ambiguity. Allow yourself to not know who you are, without treating it as a personal failure. Carl Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Crisis does not come to destroy you. It comes to an end, a version of you that has completed its role. Self-respect in this phase is not about appearing strong, but about not forcing yourself to be okay when you are not. Boundaries are not about cutting off the world, but about not letting the world pull you back into the old simply because it is familiar and easier to explain. And returning to the self, in this phase, is not about discovering a new person. It is about staying with yourself, even when you do not yet have answers, even when you do not know where you are going next. Because the moment you stop running from that ambiguity, you have already begun to live more truthfully. Life does not begin when everything becomes clear. It begins when you are brave enough not to betray yourself, even in the phases when you do not yet know who you are becoming. Perhaps, after everything we have gone through, you are beginning to realize something very simple. What exhausts people the most is not suffering, but living too long in a version of themselves that is no longer true. The masks, the cycles, the conflicts, and the crises do not come to punish you, but to remind you that it is time to stop and listen more deeply. Carl Jung once said, "We meet ourselves time and again, in 1,000 disguises, on the path of life." Perhaps, the journey of finding yourself is not about becoming someone else, but about having the courage to realize how long you have been lost from your own self. If you see yourself somewhere in what has just been shared, remember that you are not alone. You are simply stepping into a more mature stage, one that is more honest with yourself. And if this content has meaning for you, please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with those who may need to hear it. Thank you for staying until the end. I look forward to meeting you again in the deeper journeys ahead.